So question one, it is obvious to all that government has a spending problem and they have overtaxed and piled on fees to an unlivable extent. What is your plan?
Well, actually, I'm not sure it is so obvious to all. It doesn't seem to be obvious to the 9 members of the city council and the mayor's office right now, but the data does suggest that we do have a spending and management problem, not a revenue problem. And in terms of the plan to address that, it's really twofold. One, we have to reorganize City Hall. So as I mentioned in the forum, we've seen city staffing increase 27 times faster than the city's population growth, and yet performance is lower today than it was 10 years ago. So that obviously is a management problem. So unless we're willing to bring staffing levels back down to where they were in 2015, there's no way we're going to address the city's operational deficit or spending gap to actually fulfill our unmet maintenance funding for streets and facilities. So we have to get back down there, but also we need to change, number two, we need to change the model of how government delivers services. Obviously, City Hall has failed to deliver on operations. It's not a good operator, but where it can come into play is providing oversight and implementing managed competition to attract proposals and contracts from third-party providers to perform basic city services, and they can serve in an oversight capacity to make sure those contracts are fulfilled. So that's really the only way to solve the budget deficit right now.
So that kind of, one of the later questions is, it sort of applies to this, so I'll ask it. Will you reduce city staffing, especially senior managers?
Have to, absolutely. Like you have to. Mathematically, if you want to close the budget deficit, you want to reduce this, not just reduce the structural deficit, but end the structural deficit. You have to make major personnel changes, or you have to be willing to increase taxes significantly. So as far as I'm concerned, given that the city took in an all-time high record amount of tax revenue last year, there should be no new revenue sources on the table.
Okay. Will you support Proposition 13 taxpayer protections?
Absolutely. Yeah. And just in case anyone brings this up, there's this narrative going around that Prop 13 makes it so that people don't pay their fair share with property taxes. Well, I actually looked at the numbers, and when you compare California versus the other states, what you find is that California is number 1 or number 2 in sales tax, number 1 or number 2 in income tax, number 1 in gas tax. And then when you get down to property tax, on a median basis, we actually pay the 8th highest amount in the country. So the notion that Prop 13 is suppressing tax revenue just simply isn't borne out relative to the rest of the nation.
Will you move public employees to a 401k and eliminate public pensions? If not, how would you address the city employee pension deficit?
Yeah, so the city employee pension obligations are directly tied to the number of personnel and the compensation of the personnel. So the reason our pension contributions are so high now is because we've seen staffing increase and we've seen fairly generous pay packages. So pension calculation is a product of those two inputs. So by reducing personnel across the board back down to 2015 levels, that would bend our pension cost curve down by about $100 million per year, just right there. And that's without even touching the pensions. Because of how California's collective bargaining works, you would have to get labor union approval to go to a 401k style plan. I think that's unlikely, just being realistic here. Or you could go back to the voters. We saw how that turned out over a decade ago. There's one little technicality and the judge threw it out. So I think as much as I believe that most of city staffing should go to a 401k, just like their peers over in the private sector, I think politically it's probably not realistic, but I do think we should be pushing for that. So short answer is yes, but I think it's probably unlikely.
Would you support changing the way city residents have been asked to pay for trash pickup? Would you change it to a private trash company rather than a city-run business on our property tax bills?
Yes and yes. So I think the city, just like they had for all San Diego's existence, collected trash using the property taxes, using general fund tax revenue. If the city is not going to go that direction, like if this trash fee repeal is successful, and I suspect it will be, and the city wants to, wants to pursue, if the trash fee repeal is successful, I think the city has to then look into utilizing a third-party trash hauler. One, it'll provide better value, and two, it'll be able to do it for less. And we know this is true because all the other cities in the county utilize a third-party trash hauler. And also most of those third-party trash haulers are already operating within the city of San Diego. They're just collecting trash from the parcels that are not currently covered by the city. And so you just have a situation where, because of the city's own regulations, you have a very inefficient trash collection service. Mm-hmm. This could be handled a lot differently and for a lot more affordably for both the city and the ratepayers.
Okay. Where do you stand on sanctuary cities?
Opposed. It's a misnomer. That's a misnomer. Yeah.
If you had to drop out of the race and had to select another candidate to support, who would it be?
I would say either Mike Rickey or Mandy Havlick. And Mike Rickey is, I find him to be just a very, very good guy that's in the race for all the right reasons. And I had a personal, one of my close friends, their son, I actually left this comment on one of your posts the other day. Their son was not great academically. So he was not really didn't want to go to a 4-year college, but he loved being on the water. He just felt at home on the water. Mike Rickey, given his experience as a merchant captain, he was telling me about his background, and it just reminded me a lot of this younger man I know. And I asked, "Hey, would you be willing to meet with this guy?" And he goes, "Yeah, absolutely." And so I connected them, and Mike spent 3 hours with this kid. He was 20 years old, just trying to figure out his way in life. And I just, it meant a lot to me. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Mike. And then Mandy, I think her heart's definitely in the right place as well. And, she wants to represent her community. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate her energy and her passion there.
What is your view on affordable housing that's not really affordable, and ADUs everywhere without infrastructure planning?
Yeah, once again, the whole affordable housing push is also a bit of a misnomer. It's from an economic standpoint, affordable housing quote unquote affordable housing creates a lot of deadweight loss. Why does it do this? Well, there are different types of affordable housing, but generally speaking, all affordable housing, at least temporarily, requires subsidies. And those subsidies either come from taxpayers that are ineligible to live in that housing, which is, in my opinion, just unfair, right? If you're going to charge me for something, that I should at least be eligible to benefit from it. Or it requires additional market rate housing to be built. Oftentimes, it comes without any parking considerations, which produce bigger traffic and parking impacts on the surrounding community that, once again, is not even eligible to live in the affordable housing units that are being built. So I take a lot of issue with affordable housing, and I point to 101 Ash Street. That's supposed to be affordable housing at a tune of $1.1 million per unit, all subsidized by taxpayers in one shape or form or another. That's not affordable. That's a tremendous waste of taxpayer funds.
What will you do to support transparent community input with real influence and not just symbolic hearings?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer from the standpoint of, I hate giving generalities and speaking in platitudes, but I think that's probably the only way you can answer this question. My understanding of local government is that the best decisions come from the people that are closest to the impacts of those decisions. They don't come from the top down. And we've seen the city roll out a lot of top down decisions that by the time they got down to us little people here at the bottom, we're like, these are terrible decisions. And it's because they didn't actually meet with the stakeholders. They met with the special interests in City Hall that pushed for a lot of this, but they didn't actually meet with the people that have to deal with the parking and traffic and higher fees, et cetera. I think just by my nature, I am someone that's out and about in the public. I don't have a lot of close friends in City Hall. I'm not part of the insider crowd over there. And I think that gives me an advantage when it comes to actually representing the everyday San Diegans that just want to go to work, take their kids to and from school, know that their communities are safe and clean, and enjoy the amenities. and really just focus on living their own lives. Like that's who kind of surrounds me. And so I'll naturally be inclined to take their perspectives with me to City Hall. But in addition to that, I'd point to my time as mayor where we didn't have a budget for community outreach. So everything I did for community outreach, I started my own newsletter. I'd hold quarterly town halls all throughout the city. We had different pockets of Coronado. People always say, "Oh, it's so small," but every community's got these different pockets to it. And so I really try to be as accessible as possible, and that's how I would be as a council member.
Would you scale back or cancel Pure Water Phase 2?
Based on my understanding of it, and that's one area where I haven't gone into as much as I have the other issues. Based on my understanding of it, yes, that should definitely be on the table. And the reason that should be on the table is because, right now, when you look at the costs on a per acre basis of water, the city of San Diego is paying about 80% more than what the county water authority charges. And a lot of that is due to the Pure Water project. Does that mean it can't be, beneficial in the long run and provide stable sources of water in the long run? No, but it's a water compliance issue. It's a water compliance issue, and it's something it's a project that's meant to offset what the Point Loma wastewater treatment plant is discharging. And so first and foremost, it's a water compliance project. Whether or not it can ever supply us with a good amount of water at a reasonable price, I think is a big question mark right now. Mm-hmm. This project got off on the wrong foot from the very beginning with how the contracts were administered. And it certainly hasn't lowered water costs for us right now. So that's, I believe, pausing phase 2 certainly needs to be on the table. I'll have to just put a little asterisk there because I'd like to research that one more.
Campaigns require money and large donors want some sort of quid pro quo. How will you handle this? It's probably the issue with the biggest impact on how the city is currently run, developers, unions, special interests as examples.
Yeah, I think that, for me, all of my donors, they're all in San Diego. They're just everyday people. The vast majority of them have no business interest in front of the city. Some of them certainly do have business interest in front of the city, but the most you can donate on an election basis is $800. And so my goal is to be so well funded from so many people in San Diego that there isn't even the appearance of someone being able to have outsized influence with me. And also, I think that one thing I bring to the table that I think differentiates me from other candidates is that I have so many publicly stated positions on so many issues that I think it would be really hard for someone to accuse me of not being on the record on an issue and then, of hiding where I really stand on issues. So kind of what you see is what you get. And, people want to get behind that financially, great. And if they don't, that's okay. But either way, my policy positions are my policy positions. They're not going to change.
Why are we still subsidizing the San Diego Zoo with our property taxes? Would you support removing that tax as the zoo is very profitable and no longer needs support?
Good question. That would require a vote of the people because the public actually voted for this many, many years ago when the zoo was in a much different financial position. And fortunately, the zoo is in a very healthy financial position right now. And I think the San Diego region benefits from that. I do view it as kind of a public asset. Would I be the one to champion putting repeal of that measure on the ballot for all of City of San Diego voters to decide whether or not to lower that? Probably not. And the reason for that is because I just don't think the public is there. Now, philosophically, do I think we should be subsidizing the zoo? No. On a philosophical basis, not. But an old saying, the politics is the art of the possible. And in terms of all the issues facing the city right now, where the public is 80% on one side and City Hall is 20% on the other, my gut tells me that the public would probably very much oppose reducing that subsidy. That's just my gut, but just because the zoo is so beloved. So on a philosophical basis, I certainly understand and sympathize why we shouldn't be subsidizing it, but from a practical standpoint, it's not something it's not on my priority list to tackle.
People are realizing green policies have increased the cost of living considerably. Now that people like Gates admit we're not facing an existential crisis and new reports prove the models were wrong, will you support rolling back green spending?
Yeah, most notably, this is where the city's climate action plan comes in. And, when the city can't fill potholes, the notion that the city is actually going to somehow reduce the Earth's temperatures through our actions is just absurd to me. Once again, this is another issue that, I love the environment. I love being a good steward of the environment. I've been all over the world to some very impressive places that are environmentally sensitive, and I recognize the importance of being good stewards of the environment. However, all these burdensome regulations that don't actually improve the environment, but do increase the cost of living for everyone, and all these burdensome regulations within the city's climate action plan that allows the city to feel good on paper and say, look, we're doing something, but actually makes San Diego less enjoyable to live. That's not where that shouldn't be a priority of the city at all. You can be a good steward of the environment without subjecting yourself to a ridiculous amount of spending to accomplish nothing of any consequence for the environment one way or the other.
What are your thoughts on how we as a community can address the homeless population?
Yeah, this is one that I think is a very big distinction between myself and the other candidates. Cities have a dual responsibility. We have a responsibility to connect people that want help with help on a temporary basis, but we also have a responsibility to the general public to equally enforce our laws so that we maintain clean and safe public spaces. Simply refusing help does not give you the right to violate other laws. And so, first and foremost, we have to start from the standpoint of accountability. The vast majority of homeless individuals, chronically homeless individuals, are able-bodied adults that are suffering from addiction. That's what all the data shows, and that's what that when you walk through the streets, you can see with your own two eyes. It's painfully obvious. And as anyone knows that knows someone that has suffered from addiction, more often than not, addicts will not help themselves. They just won't. They're not in a state of mind to help themselves. And this is where, some tough love, some accountability will benefit not just the general public, but it'll actually benefit these individuals. And by enforcing our laws and putting these people, in front of a judge and allowing a judge to either sentence them to jail for the laws they violated or to a drug rehabilitation program is probably the only chance they're going to have to get clean. It's not the city's role to quote unquote solve homelessness. Individuals are the only ones that have the agency to solve homelessness. And it's the city's job to enforce the rules equally. And I believe that if the city were applying the laws and enforcing the rules equally, it would give the people that are suffering from addiction an actual opportunity to get clean and back on their feet.
What are your thoughts and plans regarding the proliferation of bike lanes?
I'm a fan of bike lanes in some places, in some areas. Like in Coronado, Coronado's a very bikeable community because it has just some natural, it just has some areas that are naturally bike friendly. And in areas that are naturally bike friendly, yeah, it kind of makes sense to have some bike infrastructure there. But it's a nice to have. It's not a need to have. And when you have a city that's facing a massive structural deficit and simultaneously trying to put bike paths and bike lanes in areas that have no business having a bike path or bike lane, for example, going up Pershing. I'm a pretty athletic person, pretty active, in pretty decent shape. Going up Pershing on a road bike, man, that is a challenge. Like that is an actual challenge for a cyclist. And yet the city spent millions of dollars to build this thing. And yeah, does it look beautiful? Sure, it looks beautiful. No one can use it. Like unless you're an actual avid cyclist, which is far and few between, but no one's using that to go to and from work. And so, yeah, in some pockets they make sense. In other pockets, they're a tremendous waste of money, especially when the city's facing this massive structural deficit. So in Coronado, we could have bike lanes everywhere because it made sense there. The city of San Diego, it doesn't make sense.
Do you support keeping the 30-foot height limit along the coast, especially in the area that was affected by 2020 Measure C?
Yes, I generally support maintaining a 30-foot height limit along the coastline. The reason I say generally is because I also do support the redevelopment of the sports arena. It's very old. It's fallen apart. Like, I don't think anyone objects to having a new arena on site. Well, a new arena is, of course, going to be over 30 feet tall. So that would have to exceed the 30-foot height limit. Now, that being said, the reality that a lot of people, I think, are missing online when I see some of the Nextdoor threads about the 30-foot height limit is that the 30-foot height limit right now is effectively gone. Like, it does not exist right now. And it actually doesn't relate to the 2020 measure. It was 2020 measure C and then 2022 again. That's where I'm.
Yeah, I don't recall.
Yeah, whatever the height limit ballot measure was. I think there's a very strong legal case to be made that the city actually didn't need the public to rescind that based on state law and some other court decisions. And I know that's not a popular thing to say, but I think right now, if you have an affordable housing project, you can exceed the 30-foot height limit right now. And so the state law has effectively made the local 30-foot height limit kind of a moot point at this point. So yeah, do I generally support it? Yes. Is it actually in place now? It's not. And I just don't, unless there's a change in state leadership, I don't see it coming back.
What will you do to prioritize critical public safety like fire, brush clearing, police, and infrastructure spending in the budget?
Yeah, so a lot of people talk about the $100+ million deficit as the structural deficit, and it is, but that is just the operating deficit. So that's just operating expenses exceeding operating revenues. There's a much larger spending gap when you add in the annual deferred maintenance of streets and facilities. So that spending gap is a few $100 million higher. The reason I bring that up is because we know that we have about 3,000 miles of streets. We know exactly how many streetlights we have. We know exactly how many parks we have. It's very programmatic how much money is needed to maintain every mile of street and all the parks. Like, it's not a complicated formula at all. And because it's not a complicated formula, those funding levels, in my opinion, should be set by ordinance so that we have stability going forward and we know exactly how much money is going to be spent on each one of these. It also then ties the council's hands on spending money on other kind of pet projects or programs that are outside the scope of fulfilling core responsibilities. So for infrastructure, we need to get back to programmatic spending established by ordinance. From a public safety standpoint, we have fewer police officers today than we did back in 1990. So we have fewer officers today, and we also have more homeless today. And unfortunately, the homeless population represent well over 50% of all public safety calls. So and part of that is because we have a 4-contact policy, meaning that for an officer to actually take action against an individual, the first contact is informative, the second contact is a warning, the third contact is a citation, the fourth contact may or may not be an arrest. That is an obscene amount of contacts for a reduced police force on a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the population, when if they're violating the law needs to be applied equally. They should be arrested for violating the law, regardless of their housing status. If you and I go and we park within 20 feet of a curb, we're subject to citation. And I think that's a stupid rule. But the person that's living on the sidewalk, that's blocking the sidewalk, that is shooting up on the sidewalk, that's defecating on the sidewalk, is very likely to escape a ticket, but we will almost certainly get one. That is an unequal application of the law, and that is fundamentally wrong. If we were to actually enforce the law, not with a 4-contact policy, but with a 1-contact policy, my guess is that would start to clean up the homeless pretty quickly. It would also allow our officers to respond to other emergencies more quickly. We talk about fire and paramedics. Well, most people think that when there's a homeless situation, it's the police that are called, and that is often the case. But also, a lot of the homeless individuals, because they're unfortunately many of them chronically homeless, addicted to drugs, have overdoses. Well, who gets called? It's the firefighter paramedics that get called. So if they're focused on this fraction of a population, and they're unable to do all these preventative measures or be more responsive in their call times, well, that reduces public safety for the rest of us. Those are some of the reforms that I would look to address.
The vacancy tax, since that one just came up. So if you want to get further into kind of what your response is on that.
Yeah, vacancy tax is, I'm opposed to the vacancy tax. One, I think it's likely illegal and will likely get tossed out in court. So another example, the city spending probably millions of dollars for something that probably won't get passed. And also, if you accept the premise of the vacancy tax with the city taxing second homes, then you must also accept taxing second homes for inactivity. Then you must also accept the premise that the city could tax you for an empty backyard that you haven't developed an ADU in. Right? Like what is the limiting principle there? And then also, it wasn't the 5,000 vacant homes that caused the city's current housing situation. We've had vacant homes in San Diego forever. It's a destination. A lot of people have second homes here, but that's not what created the marginal increase in costs for housing. It's just not. So I'm opposed to the vacancy tax for those reasons.
What kind of to touch on that with the short-term vacation rentals and, people saying, well, if those opened up, there'd be, more housing. But what is the city? Because I haven't looked at this website in a while, but it was kind of tracked all the STVRs and, they're supposed to be monitoring that, but the city isn't.
Yeah. And I think that's, the current city council, ironically, some of the same council members that were pushing for an additional, because short-term vacation rentals already do pay TOT tax and a licensing fee, but they're pushing for an additional annual surcharge. But they were saying we're doing this because we want to free up more housing. But these are the same council members that approved the regulatory structure that allowed short-term vacation rentals just a couple of years ago. And so it's like, okay, well, if you really meant that, why did you allow the number you allowed? I don't believe you. I think you really just want more revenue. I don't think you actually want these to be turned back to housing because the city's so dependent on the TOT from the short-term vacation rentals for to float the city that it can't afford for these to turn in large numbers back to housing unit, back to long-term rentals. But nothing stops the city from changing the number of units. They would simply have to wait for the current licenses to expire. I just don't think that's what the city really wants. Mm-hmm. Which is why they're unwilling to have that conversation. They just want the tax conversation. Do you support future sales tax increases? No. Do you support raising the minimum wage in the city of San Diego? No. Do you support raising the minimum wage in the city of San Diego for different sectors? No. Do you support a transfer tax? That's a really big one. I mean, that is almost certainly the city is going to consider that at some point. And the answer to that is no.